Hello, I'm William Buursma, one of the pastors of Third Christian Reformed Church here in the city of Kalamazoo. The program you're watching is called Markings, and on Markings we try to discuss some of the religious and ethical problems that face people in the 1980s. The subject for today is capitalism and the Roman Catholic Church. I have a guest today who is able to address that subject, and I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Rudolf Siebert. And Dr. Siebert is the Professor of Religion and Society, and he's the Director of the Center for Humanistic Future Studies here at Western Michigan University. And Dr. Siebert, you have been on the program before, and I welcome you once again.
Thank you.
Before we get into the subject itself, we were talking about some of the things you've done over the past and a project which you have coming up, namely your involvement in a conference in Yugoslavia. Could you tell us just a bit about that?
Yes, I have gone to Yugoslavia for about 13 years now, and we have an international course there on the future of religion. And this year it will be on the future of religion, the problem of humanism. You know, we have this in this country too, secular humanism and religion, and how these two things fit together. And then also, of course, the Marxist countries are in a crisis now, and it's a crisis of humanism to a large extent. So I'm looking forward to it. We have scholars from North America, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Near East, Africa, and it looks like a very good project for this year.
I'm somewhat surprised that you've been doing this for 13 years in a country that, at least until recently, has been considered pretty firmly in the Iron Curtain mentality.
Yes, yeah.
There hasn't been all that much openness in the Yugoslavian society. What accounts for the fact that you were able to get into there and have this kind of a conference?
Yeah. Well, you know, of course, that the Marxist countries are more differentiated than we usually think. So, therefore, if you go to Hungary or to go to Yugoslavia, you have a certain form of humanistic Marxism which is very open for all kinds of questions, including religious questions. And of course, I had to ask for permission all the time, and Tito gave us the permission. I visited him even once, and we had a discussion about it. So all these 13 years, we had no difficulties to get the permission. But sometimes the certain professors who were controversial could not come. And when we forced it and brought them in, then the students, the Yugoslav students, couldn't come. So little things like that happen. But we tried to maybe to have the same course in Cuba. And there we have great problems with the Central Committee, because there's a tremendous struggle about religion still. Is religion still colonialistic? Is it still oppressive? Or has really something changed in terms of liberation theology and based communities and so on? And so we have no answer yet, because there is an inner struggle going on. Then also, of course, the Cubans are very practical people, and high-level sociological or philosophical discourse is not so easy to get to. So. But it would be nice to penetrate there as well.
Right. Now, that, in a sense, leads us right to our topic. You had this conference in a country which is not capitalistic. We're going to be talking about capitalism in the Roman Catholic Church. Normally, one associates the Roman Catholic Church, in some ways at least, with a kind of openness, which is also a characteristic of a capitalistic society. Do you think there's something about the Roman Catholic interpretation of Christianity that lends itself to capitalism and is comfortable in that kind of society compared to a more structured society?
Well, of course, you know that Catholicism or Christianity in general, and this is true for the other world religions too, did not feel very comfortable when modernity arose and the secularization and civil society was growing, the capitalistic society. And so the difficulties were partially philosophical, like Aristotle said, you know, that, of course, when you put, no, he didn't say that, I just turned it around a bit, but if you put $2 into a little box, you don't get a 50-cent baby out, you know, even if you wait 9 months or 10 months or so. And then, of course, in the New Testament, you should not even take the principal sum back, not to think of paying interest. And through the whole Middle Ages, you know, that everything was usury. I mean, everything what we do now was usury. Right. Except that then, of course, the Church adjusted practically, the Pope taking money and giving money and so on. And then also the theory changed. But I think up to today, a businessman, a Catholic businessman, could really, by the statutes of the Church, not take more than 2.5 or so % of profit. After that, it becomes again what it was before, usually a mortal sin, so to speak, which prevents salvation. So we see from that Roman Catholicism was not very comfortable with capitalism, and you have in the 19th century popes, one who wrote the syllabus, in which he condemned liberalism. Usually it was called liberal capitalism and so on, in all its aspects and so on. So now it was a practical adjustment, but the church always tried to move. Now when the socialists came up and practically also challenged the surplus value, where it comes from the workers and so on, the church then tried to maneuver between those two fronts. On one side Marxist collectivism, and on the other side liberal capitalism. But I think up to today, it is not a totally comfortable type of a thing. Because the way how, in spite of all openness, aggiornamento of John the 23rd or so, Catholicism remains critical in the encyclical letters and also in the New Liberation theology, even more so, critical of capitalism. Or put it that way, we are usually used to look at the positive side of capitalism, and there is a lot of positive, tremendous productivity, the swimming pools and the cars, which are a little bit too expensive and so on. But most of us in the middle classes or in the upper classes, we live quite a good life and so on. But there is, of course, a negative side to it. And it seems to me that Catholicism has considered it its duty to, in the name of the victims, to point to these negative sides.
If you go back to the early church, there was at least a temporary experiment with something that is pretty close to communism. Do you have any insights on why that failed, why that did not become normative in the church? A kind of an enlightened communism, a sharing as they did in the early church?
Yeah. Well, you have two places in the Acts, where this is described. And of course, this early church, let's see, the first century, the Jewish church and so on, and later on also the Greco-Roman church was very pluralistic in a certain sense, many different cities and so on. So I don't think that the whole church ever had this. It was true for some groups and so on. And of course, also among the philosophers, Epicure and so on discussed that too, and they would say not to have private property would mean somewhat to distrust each other. And how can friends distrust each other? And so, and then, of course, with the end of the martyrs, the monk developed, and the whole monasticism developed. And then this recommendation, in the Sermon on the Mount and all this, I think it moved into the monasteries, where you want to live a particular perfect life, while the common community could not reach this perfection. Already in early times where somebody said he sold something and hadn't sold it and got the heart attack, and his wife came and so on. So we see from these little stories, that it was never simple, the whole thing from the beginning. Okay, maybe you could put it in terms of perfection, I mean, to not to put your will in private property, in possessions, is something very hard to take for many people. And I think there is also a justification to give your freedom this type of expression. Of course, that means in terms of property. Of course, capitalism is much more than just private property.
Yes. Now, what again, historically, I think the perception of many people is that the Catholic Church, and in a measure also Protestantism, has a tendency after a while to identify itself with the ruling structure, has been somewhat muted in its criticism of excesses, and that perhaps in recent times with the upsurge of the liberation theology, there's a little bit of a difference. But that when I think, for example, in World War II and the years immediately preceding it, the Roman Catholic Church, particularly Rome now, did not distinguish itself by making itself separate from and witnessing against fascism, Nazism. It had a kind of almost paranoid fear of the communist movement. And so I think the perception is that the Roman Catholic Church has been pretty comfortable with capitalism and with the contemporary society and with the rulers and the structures. Am I articulating correctly the perception, and is that perception correct?
I think to some extent it is, I mean, from your own church and all churches that there is a double problem. There is the maintenance, the pattern maintenance of the organization, and this costs something, On the other side, there is the mission which a church has, a critical mission, a messianic mission, a prophetic mission, and so on. And there are tensions between this, On one side, you sometimes go too far to the maintenance and you forget all the prophetic tasks which you have. And if you go too far on the messianic and prophetic side, then what happens to your church organization? Now, the fascist case is, of course, it's a paradigmatic, in a certain sense, and I lived it through. I was part of the Catholic underground in Germany, youth movement and so on, and we are not very proud, of all this, what has happened. The church had its martyrs, They were priests, they were who died together with the gypsies and the Jews and the Polish political prisoners and the prisoners of from Russia and so on, who died in the work camps and concentration camps. But recently we celebrated, or we remembered, and cannot celebrate this horrible thing of the Crystal Night, the Reichskristallnacht.
Yes.
And I came out of a swimming pool on this day, and suddenly I saw this building burning. I was 11 years old, and it took me some time to see what was going on. It wasn't called right away Reichskristallnacht neither. And so then I saw the main street in Frankfurt, the things thrown out of the windows. I could have seen that the names of the department stores were all Jewish inside. But when all this happened, and when 80 Jews were killed the same night, and 32,000 were let into concentration camps, there was not a word from the churches. Not a word from the churches. I mean, this is terribly shameful in a certain sense, And, but on the other hand, when one gets older, one isn't so sharp on the negative anymore, right? So therefore one sees also the other side. They should, if they had been prophetic, you see, the bishops, let's say, they would have to stand up, of course, and it's a horrible failure. But there is the other side, of course, this maintenance thing. You want to maintain your organization. You have the orphanages, you have the hospitals or whatever, and the kindergartens, you depend on the economy and so on. So you always vacillate like a good family father in a certain sense. What will this do when I am prophetic? Well, you know what happened to Jesus when he was prophetic, and to all the martyrs and so on. So one doesn't risk it then. But it is very sad, from this point of view, this accommodation. Where does the accommodation to a social organization becomes betrayal of the prophetic critical function which the church has? This is
that's a very hard question to answer,
yes,
of course.
Yeah. And one should not be, we have to be judgmental, right? But one shouldn't be too judgmental in that sense that one cannot look through the eyes of the bishops anymore.
Yeah, and it's only fair to say, too, that it was not just the Roman Catholic Church that was historically mute, silent at that time, but that was true of the Lutherans in Germany. There was very little organized resistance, and you mentioned how you were in the Roman Catholic underground, the youth movement, but it was clearly not, the majority of people went along, and who knows what would have happened here in this country. So I think you're right that we have to be...
Because, see, the power atmosphere, it is undescribable. I have not found any artist, you see, who can... I saw Hitler the last time in the bunker in the Taunus during the Ardennes offensive, The atmosphere there, which is there, so it needs such an immense courage, you see, to speak out or so. Well, we should have had this courage, of course, But it was just not there, So my pastor had the courage, He was beaten up in a Gestapo basement in Frankfurt. These are impressions, which have carried through my whole life and determined me, you see, very deeply. But not everybody had this tremendous guts, which that takes.
Now, I've been intrigued by one thing, and that is that you stop at the level of the bishop when you talk about, well, we could hardly expect the bishops to do other than that, or they'd be understanding because of the accommodation and the necessity of keeping the institution going. You do not mention the Pope. I think, generally speaking, many Protestants at least feel that that's where the leadership should have come from, and the Vatican was silent. The Vatican was silent in the excesses of Mussolini, and went along with much of the philosophy of the Hitler movement.
Yeah, I mean, not only were they silent, I mean, that would have been one thing, but Pacelli, Pius XII, and before his predecessor already made the Lateran Treaty with Mussolini. Then Pacelli, was part of it. Even Roncalli, the later John the 23rd, worked for the Lateran Treaty, and shaped it and framed it. And the same thing is also true for the Concordat, for the Empire Concordat with Hitler. And the same thing is true for the Concordat with Lisbon and with Madrid and with Vienna and so on. See, when the state power of the feudal system broke down, and in the First World War, you see, then they looked very unprophetically, by the way, for a new hold in the world, and then came these powerful fascist states. And then you said it already, in Catholic Romanticism, There was since 1800 the fear, you know, that when the kings would fall, then we would have either a bourgeois dictatorship, or some of them predicted already a socialist dictatorship in Russia. And so they wanted to, according to their beautiful principle of the lesser evil, rather wanted to go with bourgeois power, which they didn't like very much neither, but it would be the lesser evil in comparison to this proletarian type of dictatorship, which would be so outrageous that one wouldn't know with whom to talk any longer. And so that is the thing. It is very tragic, I would say. And no one can ask, of course, why does somebody stay in the church, you know, which has failed or terribly. And I think I would say that I stay because of my remembrances, you know, of this minority who represented the prophetic Christianity, otherwise not so
Do you think that there are prophetic voices today being raised in the Roman Catholic Church, addressing the evils of society and perhaps even the evils of unbridled capitalism? Do you hear voices that are speaking to that subject?
Yeah, we have Bergen, of course, you know, Robert Bergen, book there, and they, of course, are pacifists at the same time. They approach it particularly over the war issue, you know, capitalism and war and so on. Then we have the bishop's letter, of course, on the economy, which is, of course, a more New Deal style, you know.
Right.
But it is also a criticism of capitalism. And then you have, of course, the Liberation Front, which takes social analysis from Marxism and is much tougher than the bishops and the Pope is. I think that the bishops, the Pope, and the priests and so on have learned from the horrible fascist experience. And so I think that is a positive, very positive thing.
Do you hear of any negative reaction to this on the part of Roman Catholics? Are there any people that are upset by some of these statements coming from the Vatican, or some of these statements issued by bishops on the whole question of social justice and the capitalistic system compared to the communist?
Yeah. I mean, you have a heretical movement on the far right, you know, Bishop
in France.
In France, yes. And then you have also, let's see, I'm thinking of a Jesuit who is the father of one of our FBI chiefs, once CIA chiefs, or whatever it was, a Jesuit, you know, who would say that in Washington, D.C., in the Catholic University there, who would say that the bishops should not write these letters, the Pope should not write these letters, that Catholicism should go back into the ghetto in a certain sense, and there have masters, the priests, spiritual masters, and should celebrate in parish life, you know, funerals and weddings and so on, but leave out their hands off, you know, the economy and the polity and so on. That is there. And then, of course, also people, you know, who are stressing very much the positive side of capitalism, and then would charge, you know, the Pope or the Bishop being communist or something like that. That happens.
What's your personal opinion as to a kind of environment, ambience in which the Christian faith, forget now about Roman Catholic or Protestant, but the Christian faith can flourish? Is it going to be better off in a capitalistic system or in a more strictly regimented system?
Well, I mean, they are both secular systems, right? So in that sense, they both constitute a challenge to a faith community, without doubt. Now, I would say why it sounds funny in a certain sense, why it may be easier, at least in the past, you know, to be a Christian in a socialistic system is that things are clear. That means there are no attempts in a socialistic system, or very few, to make use of religion as a means of social control. So therefore, you know where the government stands. You know where the functionaries stand. You know that they have a constitution. Usually it's the Swiss constitution, according to which you have freedom of religion. Let's see, in Yugoslavia and in Russia too. But you know that you have to pay a price, that if you go to church, you know, you cannot be the party. And if you're not in the party, you cannot move up in the hierarchy of the corporations or the state machinery or so. You have to pay a price. Children can't be educated either. Yeah, well, your children may be converted. I mean, they will try their best to make their children into good citizens and so on. So there is no doubt that where they want to go is from socialism to communism as a free society. You know, we have no communism yet. We have socialistic societies which want to go to communism, and we have socialist society which don't want to go, and so on. Russia is one which wants to go, and China and so on. So therefore, they would like to go to a totally secular society, which has lots of problems, particularly the problem of meaning and all this, and they start to see this now, and that has something to do with the prices in Marxism, I would say. But nevertheless, the picture is clear when you are a Christian, let's see, in Moscow and so on. While here, you see, you may think that this is a whole Christian country or something like that. You see, some people on the, the fundamentalists would say that the fathers of the Constitution were Christians. They were deists. They were not Christians. Washington was not a Christian. They were deists, and came from the encyclopedists in the French Enlightenment and so on. And the Great Enlightenment. I don't want to play it down or so. But see, it is more difficult here to distinguish clearly, what is specifically a messianic Christian type of Christianity. I mean, what it means to let the prophetic God loose, like in the Magnificat, the God who takes the powerful from their throne and sends the rich away with empty hands. Or you cannot have two masters. You cannot love capital and God at the same time. You will either love God and hate capital, or will love capital and hate God, and so on. Or no rich man can enter the kingdom of God, and so on. So here, in even our sermons, we try to play this prophetic thing down in order not to bother people too much.
I find myself basically in agreement with what you're just saying, particularly as you're quoting the scripture on some of the teachings of the Bible concerning mammon and the service of God. But how do you answer the question or the comment of the person who says, in capitalism, the average citizen has a higher and better living standard, even though there are inequities and there are some people who are tragically poor in the capitalistic system. Whereas in communism, in general, it's kind of a drab survival, and it does not have the success in a material way. How does one answer that? Is there something about capitalism that makes it possible for more people to live well than it is under communism?
Well, all this, we would like to say, of course, that this all has been decided, but in reality, it hasn't been decided, really, and the church, at this moment at least, has a certain dialectical attitude. It will criticize, the negative things in socialism and the negative things in capitalism. It will appreciate whatever may be positive. So it will positive is that in a socialistic country, from the cradle to the grave, you are somewhat taken care of. In Russia, you cannot be unemployed. The emphasis on material rights. See, we have only codified formal rights, the right to speak, the right of religion. We have left out the material rights, the right to clothing, the right to food, the right to housing, the right to job, In Moscow, you can go to court because you don't have a job, because the state is obligated to give you a job. And so we have left that out because it would be too expensive, It would go, we would, what did Reagan say recently? We would slaughter the goose who lays the golden egg. So on one side, the church appreciates, of course, that people have a higher living standard and all. It would be stupid not to, and so on. But the criticism, if you put it in religious terms, is in both cases, of course, in the capitalistic case too, is the criticism of possible idolatry. And that is, of course, that is a prophetic concern, All the prophets had nothing worse to fight against than idolatry. And there is, of course, I think in a vulgar form where somebody says, right or wrong, my country, love it or leave it, that is idolatry. Where you make your country, let's say a capitalistic country, into the absolute judge about what is good and bad, So that when we have problems, like see the sanctuary movement, and somebody appeals to something beyond the nation, to a higher law, he cannot be heard because there isn't any except the one we do. But there is also, of course, the danger, in capitalism, that the highest value is the private appropriation of collective labor, the bottom line, where there is no room for human beings. So if I have to take my tools, to Taiwan because the girls work there for $20 a month, and here I have to pay $20 a day, then there is no care about the flag or national solidarity. I go there where I find the most profit, the cheapest labor, and so on. And so it is possible then, you see that the system makes itself autonomous, sets itself absolute, And the labor camps and death camps in capitalistic Germany, you see, was a manifestation where this idolatry of the market can finally lead to. Because you have to see, that these labor camps were there in order to bring cheap labor to the corporations and not the tools to cheap labor. And then the SS doctor came when they couldn't work any longer, like the old people, or not yet, you know, then they were gassed finally and so on. And then even the commodification of people went on after death, in that sense that their hairs were put into cushions and their skins into lampshades, and their clothing was collected, and their gold teeth and so on and so on, you know, where you have where the logic of capitalism came to its utmost and showed its hellishness. Now, here we say, of course, in our textbooks, you know, don't sell your country. Well, yesterday somebody sold his country anyway to the Russians, you know, and don't sell your mother. But, you know, our mothers are the most exploited people in the country. They raise the children up to 21. The children go to a corporation, produce their surplus value to corporations who have never made a contribution to their education, or little, you know. So it is this type where, from a Catholic point of view, we would have the greatest trouble. That they both, let's see, socialism and capitalism are relative systems, relative modes of production, that some has more advantage than the other, and so on. This type of thinking is normal, that's natural. But as soon as one of them sets itself up, absolutizes itself as the only one, and the same thing is true for socialism. If socialism would say that the realm of freedom, you know, is the replacement of the kingdom of God, and is therefore absolute, that would be idolatry, and no Christian could cooperate with it.
You're a historian as well as a Christian. What's your prognosis for the future of capitalism and the future of socialism, communism? Who's going to win that battle for men's minds and souls and bodies?
Well, you know, there are people like Galbraith and others who would say that in in the future we may not emphasize this capitalism anymore and socialism anymore. That is rather that we move toward industrial society, and that in this industrial society who really governs is the manager in terms of an entirely instrumental rationality, or what I call future number one, you know, the totally administered, totally monetarized society, totally bureaucratized society, and that not the owners of capital make the real decisions anymore, and that not the political functionaries make the real decisions anymore, but the technical functionaries, you know, are really directly involved in production. That is one thing, you know. There is the war future, which is a horrible one, but the best one, which I always try to move to with my teaching and my work, would be, of course, a reconciled society.
So perestroika, you feel there's some possibility for this becoming a ongoing thing?
Yes,
reconciling,
it depends on us, you see, because it depends if Gorbachev's analysis of us is right, that we cannot afford to be more colonialistic any longer, that we cannot afford to be imperialistic anymore, that we cannot afford really make wars, because there is now an Eastern Bloc, and because many other things have changed in capitalism. If he is right in that, his perestroika thing will go through. If not, his own right will tumble him. You see, they will say, you told us that, but see, they are still arming, they are still colonialistic, they are still imperialistic as they always were, and then he will fall. And this would be very unfortunate, because it would move to the right over there, and our own hawks would come out more than they are already.
Well, Dr. Siebert, it's been a pleasure to have you here today. And you're a very learned man. You certainly have a kind of a global view of the situation. And so we're very, very happy to have you here, and we're looking forward to having you again. And sometime we ought to be talking about your new book, which is entitled From Critical Theory to Communicative Political Theology. It sounds quite
Universal
heavy.
Solidarity.
Okay, Universal Solidarity, right. It sounds quite heavy, but I've scanned it. There's some very interesting material here, and we should talk about it.
Yes. Right.
So thank you very much. And folks, do join us again in the future for another program of Markings. It's been a pleasure having you with us today.